decision by the Supreme Court where they said, forget the plain language of the statute, forget the separation of powers, forget what the legislative branch wrote in the statute, in the Affordable Care Act. The Supreme Court said, forget all that, we're going to side with the Obama administration, even though the language said, unless you're a state that set up a state exchange, you're not eligible for the subsidies. They said, forget that, we're just going to side with the administration. Obamacare's fine. Very next day, the Supreme Court said, forget thousands of years of Western culture, forget the fact that in Ohio, democratically, the people said just 11 years ago, marriage should be what it's always been, overwhelming majority, 60-some%. They said, forget about all that, forget about, we're going to decide today that marriage is something than it's always been. 2 weeks after that, you have a city that says, forget about the rule of law, forget about what federal law says, we're a sanctuary city, and a young lady is killed in cold blood in front of her family. And frankly, the Justice Department does actually not much of anything. Then you have, a week after that, you have the President of the United States say, forget about 50-some years of communist rule in Cuba, forget about the Castro regime and the oppression and the taking of property and the human rights violations and everything else they've done. We're going to begin to normalize relations with communist Castro Cuba. Even though the legislative branch is not weighted on this, we're just going to start down this trail. A few days after that, the administration says, we got an agreement with Iran, the largest state sponsor of terrorism in the world, an agreement that is, by just about everyone's definition except John Kerry and President Obama, a terrible agreement. I mean, think about some of the things in this agreement. $150 billion gets freed up for Iran to use. They're going to use a lot of that money for bad things, right? Anytime, anywhere inspections are anything but anytime, anywhere. It's 24 days minimum lead time to notice that this regime is going to get. The arms embargo is lifted. When you have countries in the Middle East like Israel and Arab countries on the same page saying this agreement is dangerous, that should tell us, that should tell us a lot right there. And then finally, remember the premise and the goal all along was to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear nation, and now we spell out in the next 10 years, here's how you get to be a nuclear nation. So you have all those 5 things, and then of course probably the one that's most troubling. And I don't really encourage people to watch any of the videos, but it's probably worth watching at least one of them, part of it, to just see the disgusting and cavalier attitude folks at Planned Parenthood had regarding the terrible things they were doing. So those 6 things in a 7-week time frame, hitting families and people in this country, like I say, any one of those is big news, but yeah, we get them all in the last several weeks. So I tell, the last couple of days I've been telling groups I've had the chance to visit with, thank you for stepping up and being involved. It is a critical time. When we go back in September, we're going to have some big issues. We got the Iran issue, which will dominate the first couple of weeks of September. And then we're going to have as you all know, our fiscal year ends September 30th, so the whole funding the government debate will take place. Along with Planned Parenthood as part of that debate, there's been a group of us, 18 of us, who signed a letter saying, we are not going to support any funding bill that sends 1 penny of your tax dollars to an organization engaged in what look, this is, in my judgment, it's beyond politics, it's beyond Washington games, this is just a simple moral question. And frankly, they should have never been getting your tax dollars in the first place. Remember, 4 years ago, they were caught on tape talking to a minor about this whole procedure. They should have been defunded a long time ago, but certainly now, in light of what's been put on these tapes. So those will be the big issues. The other one, of course, is with the Supreme Court decision relative to marriage. It is important. You followed some of the debate in that when the arguments were made. Judge Alito asked the Solicitor General, he said, well, what's to stop if the court decides to redefine marriage? What's to stop the government from saying to certain Christian colleges, universities, or for that matter, even churches, threatening their tax-exempt status because they're, remember, the First Amendment talks about your free exercise of religion, not just freedom of religion, free exercise, how you practice your faith. He said, what's to stop the government from trying to weigh in and take away people's tax-exempt nonprofits and churches' tax-exempt status? And the Solicitor General's answer was chilling. He said, well, that's going to be a real question. So he didn't say, well, that's not going to happen. He said, well, that's something will happen. And he sort of indicated that that's where it's headed next. So one of my best friends, Raul Labrador, Raul's office is right next to mine in the Longworth building, and truly one of my best friends in Congress. He's got a bill that would protect churches and nonprofits, your ability to, it's called your First Amendment Defense Act, to protect your right to practice your faith and exercise your faith. So that'll be one of the other big issues that we'll deal with in September. I think we can get it passed in the House and get it passed in the Senate. I don't know that the President's going to sign it, but it's still one of those important things. And then finally, the last thing I'd say that we're working on, and then I'll take any questions, comments you have. And I've talked to you all about this before, but one of the things that scares me most about where we are today as a country is this idea that there's now in America two standards. There's one for we the people, and there seems to be a separate standard if you're connected to the big shots in government. It can be a big corporation who cozies up to big government and gets a special deal at the expense of middle-class families, middle-class business owners, or it can be the favored people in an administration. They get to live under one set of rules, and the rest of us, we the people, have to live under another set. So the one issue that I've been real involved with the last 2 years is the targeting that took place of groups just like this by the Internal Revenue Service. And this idea that, if we engage in anything like what the IRS has done, relative to how they've handled documents and failed to produce documents and in essence destroyed documents, if any of that happened to us while we were being audited by the IRS, oh my goodness, we'd be in all kinds of trouble. But somehow it's okay for the federal government and this particular agency to do what they've done. So we think it's important to send a signal and say to bureaucrats, high-ranking officials in the government, it's not good enough if you're engaged in the kind of behavior that Mr. Koskin and the IRS commissioner did engage in. So if you get a chance, 2 weeks ago today, a colleague of mine, Congressman DeSantis from Florida, and we had a piece in the Wall Street Journal calling for the impeachment of John Koskin, the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service. We lay all the facts out there pretty clearly, but the simple truth is this. If you remember the timeline here, we called for an audit, an investigation by the Inspector General. They do the investigation. The IRS and the Treasury Department learned that the Inspector General is going to come back with a report that's scathing, that says you engaged in targeting of conservative groups. They see this coming. So 3 days before the Inspector General is going to release his report, Lois Lerner, at a staged event, May 10, 2013, staged event, Bar Association meeting in, Bar Association meeting in Washington, D.C., with a planted question from one of her friends, lies to the American people. And she says, it wasn't us in Washington, it was line agents at the Cincinnati office. Remember this? Right? Blatant lie, total lie. 12 days later, she comes in front of our committee and takes the fifth. So you have a lady who lied when she spoke publicly and then refused to answer the people's representatives' questions in a congressional hearing. So when you have that fact pattern, it really puts a premium on the documents and the communications and the record that she had established and her colleagues had established at the Internal Revenue Service. So the IRS issues a preservation order the same day she took the fifth, which was May 22nd, 2013. Same day she takes the fifth, the IRS issues a preservation order, preserve all documents, communications, records. It's a good thing, they should do that. We issue a subpoena a few months later saying we want all her documents, records, communication. So there's a preservation order in place, a subpoena in place, and on March 4th, 2014, in spite of the preservation order and subpoena in place, the Internal Revenue Service destroys 422 backup tapes, potentially 24,000 emails. 3 weeks later, March 26, 2014, John Koskinen is in front of our committee answering questions under oath, and he says repeatedly, when asked, will you get us all Lois Lerner's emails, all our communications? He says, yes, I will, which is a blatantly false statement, right? Because you can't give us all her documents if you done destroyed 24,000. And so the IRS, and in particular Mr. Koskinen, had several duties. They had a duty to preserve the documents, they had a duty to produce the documents, a duty to disclose to us if they couldn't fulfill the first two duties, a duty to testify accurately, and when it's discovered that they didn't testify accurately, a duty to correct the record. He breached every single duty he had as a person who works for all of us. And for that, we believe He should be held accountable. He should be impeached. He should no longer be commissioner of the IRS. And more importantly, that will begin to send a message to the other folks in the bureaucracy. There aren't two standards, there's one. And it applies to all the people in this great country. So that's something that we have to get our leadership to go along with it. But Congressman DeSantis and I and some others are pushing this very strongly. We think we can move forward with this and begin to hold people accountable who work for all of us and not just for the administration. So, all right.